Today, I will dedicate my all achievements to my new wife-to-be.
Damien, how could you forget this? That I am the owner and you are my CEO.
Why are you here? You don't know about Fashion Empire. Get out!
Why are you removing my picture?
It's an order, ma'am.
They're finally taking her picture down, the young model whispered with a mocking smile, lifting her champagne glass high enough for everyone around her to hear. About time. Every great fashion empire deserves a beautiful face, not an invisible wife hiding behind old memories. Laughter rippled across the grand ballroom like a wave. Some people laughed because they agreed. Others laughed because powerful people were laughing. At the center of it all stood Damien Ashford, CEO of Valora Couture, the $5 billion fashion empire that had conquered Paris, Milan, New York, and Dubai. Wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, Damien looked every bit the successful businessman the world admired. Beside him stood Celeste Monroe, the international supermodel who had become the face of Valora's latest collections and, according to every gossip magazine, the woman who had completely captured Damien's heart. Cameras flashed relentlessly as reporters fought to capture the perfect angle of the glamorous couple. Hidden near the back of the ballroom, dressed in a simple navy blue gown without a single expensive jewel around her neck, stood Damien's wife, Elena Ashford. Nobody paid attention to her. Nobody offered her a seat near the stage. Most guests assumed she was merely another member of the organizing staff because she carried herself with quiet dignity instead of demanding attention. Even the waiters received warmer smiles than she did. Yet Elena didn't seem bothered. She simply watched the stage with calm eyes, almost as if she already knew something nobody else in that room could imagine. Tonight marked Valora Couture's 15th anniversary, the biggest celebration in the company's history. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers while giant LED screens displayed the company's journey from a tiny fashion startup to one of the world's most valuable luxury brands. Every famous designer, investor, celebrity, journalist, and social media influencer had gathered to witness a special moment. According to the official invitation, tonight the company would finally reveal the portrait of the mysterious founder, whose identity had remained hidden for 15 years. The public had always assumed Damien himself was the founder. After all, every magazine cover carried his face. Every interview featured his voice. Every award was handed into his hands. No one had ever questioned the story because confidence has a strange way of becoming truth when repeated long enough. Damien raised his glass, smiling confidently at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his smooth voice filling every corner of the ballroom. 15 years ago, I had nothing except a dream. Today, that dream employs thousands of people across the world. Tonight, we celebrate not only our success but the future of Valora. Thunderous applause followed. Elena remained silent. She had heard this speech before. Different words, same lie. Damien's younger sister, Vanessa, stepped beside him wearing a sparkling silver gown that caught every camera flash. She leaned close enough that only Damien could hear. "Make sure they never see her face," she whispered. "Nobody wants an ordinary woman representing a luxury empire. They expect elegance. They expect beauty. They expect Celeste." Damien didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the enormous velvet curtain hanging behind the stage. Hidden beneath that curtain rested a framed portrait prepared weeks earlier. Very few people knew whose face it contained. Damien certainly knew. His mother, Victoria Ashford, joined them with a satisfied smile. "Your sister is right," she murmured softly. "Your wife was useful once, but businesses don't survive on loyalty. They survive on image. Give people someone worth admiring." Damien slowly nodded. Years earlier, those words would have disgusted him. Tonight, they sounded reasonable. Success had changed more than his bank account. It had rewritten his memory. Somewhere along the journey, he had stopped remembering who truly built the empire standing behind him. He lifted his microphone again. "Before we reveal the founder's portrait," he smiled confidently, "I've decided to make one small adjustment." The audience watched curiously. Event staff exchanged nervous glances. Damien pointed toward the hidden portrait. "Take it down," he ordered calmly. No one needs to see that face tonight. A young technician hesitated. Sir? That's the founder's official portrait. Damien's smile disappeared. Did I stutter? Silence swallowed the ballroom. The technician slowly lowered the hidden frame behind the curtain. Moments later, another image appeared across every giant screen inside the hall. It wasn't the founder. It wasn't Damien. It was Celeste Monroe wearing Valora's newest diamond-encrusted evening gown, smiling confidently beneath bright runway lights. The audience erupted into applause. Cameras exploded in flashes. Celeste gracefully stepped onto the stage, waving elegantly like royalty accepting her crown. Damien slipped an arm around her waist. Ladies and gentlemen, he declared proudly, allow me to present the woman who truly represents everything Valora has become. Beauty, confidence, perfection. Victoria clapped first. Vanessa followed immediately. Soon the entire ballroom joined them. Only one person didn't clap. Elena quietly watched her own place being given to another woman without saying a single word. A waiter passing nearby noticed the strange calm on her face. Ma'am, are you all right? He whispered politely. Elena smiled faintly. I'm perfectly fine, she answered. I'm simply watching people confuse the spotlight with ownership. The waiter looked confused before continuing on his way. Nearby, two fashion journalists whispered to each other. Who is that woman standing alone? One asked. No idea, the other shrugged. Probably some relative. Neither realized they were looking at the woman whose signature existed on every legal document that had built Valora Couture from nothing. Across the ballroom, standing completely alone near one of the marble pillars, an older gentleman in a charcoal gray suit quietly observed everything. He carried a leather briefcase worn smooth with age and checked his watch every few minutes. Unlike everyone else, he never looked at Celeste. His eyes never left Elena. When Damien ordered the founder's portrait removed, the old man's expression didn't change. It simply became certain. He had expected this moment for months, perhaps years. He softly adjusted his glasses and whispered under his breath, Now you've crossed the line, Damien. Elena slowly turned away from the stage and walked toward the ballroom exit. No tears, no anger, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet footsteps echoing across polished marble floors. Hidden inside the pocket of her gown rested a tiny object she had carried every single day for 15 years. As her fingers gently wrapped around it, memories she had spent years burying began rising to the surface, and she realized that before this night ended, the world would finally learn who had truly stitched together an empire that everyone else had only worn. Elena stepped into the long marble hallway outside the ballroom, and the heavy doors closed behind her, muffling the applause that still echoed inside. For a few quiet seconds, she stood completely still. She wasn't trying to hold back tears because there were none left to cry. Some wounds bleed for so long that eventually they stop hurting and simply become part of who you are. She slipped her hand into the pocket of her gown and pulled out a small silver sewing needle wrapped carefully in a faded piece of blue silk. Most people would have seen nothing special about it. To Elena, it was worth more than every diamond glittering inside that ballroom. It was the very first needle her mother had placed into her tiny hands when she was only 8 years old. Never forget, her mother had whispered. People may steal your ideas, they may steal your name, they may even steal your place, but they can never steal the hands that created it all. Elena smiled sadly as those words echoed inside her heart. She closed her fingers around the needle again, just as footsteps approached from behind. Mrs. Ashford, she turned slowly. The older gentleman in the charcoal gray suit stood before her, holding the same leather briefcase against his chest. His silver hair reflected the warm hallway lights, and his expression carried neither pity nor surprise. Good evening, Mr. Whitmore, Elena replied softly. I suppose you've seen enough. The old lawyer nodded. I've seen exactly what I feared would happen. For nearly 15 years, Richard Whitmore had remained one of Elena's closest confidants. He wasn't simply her attorney. He had witnessed every contract she signed, every patent she registered, every legal document that transformed one anonymous designer into the hidden owner of one of the world's most valuable luxury brands. More importantly, he had watched her willingly step into the shadows while another person accepted the applause. Richard sighed deeply. I warned you years ago that giving Damien complete public control would eventually make him believe the story himself. Elena looked toward the closed ballroom doors. I know. Then why didn't you stop him? She remained silent for several moments before answering. Because I love the man he used to be. Richard lowered his eyes. That answer hurt because he knew it was true. Damien hadn't always been the arrogant businessman celebrating another woman's beauty inside the ballroom. Years earlier, he had been a young salesman struggling to pay rent, borrowing suits for job interviews and dreaming of becoming someone important. Elena had loved that man. The humble man. The grateful man. Somewhere along the journey, success had introduced her to someone else entirely. Inside the ballroom, applause erupted again as photographers continued surrounding Damien and Celeste. One reporter laughed loudly. You two look like the king and queen of fashion. Damien wrapped an arm around Celeste's waist and smiled for the cameras. Tonight belongs to her, he replied confidently. She represents everything this company stands for. Vanessa stood nearby, thrilled by the media attention. She quietly leaned toward her mother. Did you see Elena's face? She finally understands where she belongs. Victoria smirked. She should have understood years ago. Quiet women don't belong in powerful rooms. Neither woman noticed several veteran investors exchanging uncomfortable glances. Something about tonight felt wrong. They couldn't explain it, but replacing the founder's portrait at the last minute seemed like an unnecessary risk. Meanwhile, Elena and Richard slowly walked toward a quieter corner of the hallway. Richard carefully opened his leather briefcase and removed a thick navy blue folder secured with an old wax seal. I've carried this with me all evening, he said. Elena stared at it without touching it. She recognized the folder instantly. 15 years earlier, after Valora Couture had been legally incorporated, Richard had insisted on preparing 2 identical master files. One remained locked inside a private bank vault. The other had never left his possession. Every trademark, every ownership certificate, every original design patent, every international licensing agreement, every signature, every page carried only one name, Elena Grace Ashford. Richard looked directly into her eyes. If you tell me to walk away tonight, I will. I'll lock these papers away again and no one will ever know the truth. Elena remained silent. He continued gently. But understand something. Damien isn't trying to erase your contribution anymore. Tonight he erased your existence. Those words settled heavily between them. For years, Elena had convinced herself that Damien was simply overwhelmed by fame, pressured by investors, influenced by his family. She had excused every broken promise, every forgotten anniversary, every interview where he accepted credit for work she had done. But tonight was different. Tonight he hadn't merely forgotten her. He had publicly replaced her. Back inside the ballroom, Damien stood proudly before the giant screens while Celeste posed gracefully beneath bright white lights. Let's make history, Damien announced. From this day forward, Valora enters a bold new era. Guests applauded once again. At the back of the audience, however, an elderly fashion editor quietly frowned. She had followed Valora since its earliest collections. Something had always puzzled her. Every original gown possessed tiny details that mysteriously disappeared from recent designs. The older dresses carried a warmth no modern designer seemed capable of recreating. It was almost as if the true artist had quietly vanished years ago. She whispered to herself, something doesn't add up. Outside, Elena finally reached for the navy blue folder. Her fingers rested lightly on its cover, but she didn't open it. Do you remember, she asked Richard softly, the first dress I ever registered? Richard smiled faintly. The midnight rose gown. Elena nodded. I borrowed fabric because I couldn't afford enough to finish it. And it sold within 3 hours. For $800. Richard chuckled quietly. You cried because you thought the customer had made a mistake. Elena laughed for the first time that evening. I really did. The laughter disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Back then I believed success would make people kinder. Richard closed the briefcase gently. Success only reveals who people already are. Silence returned between them. Finally, Richard spoke again. What are you going to do? Elena looked through the hallway window toward the city skyline, glowing beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Somewhere among those buildings stood every boutique, office, warehouse, and showroom, carrying the Valora name. Buildings the world believed Damien owned. Buildings that legally belonged to the quiet woman everyone had ignored tonight. She closed her fingers tightly around the old sewing needle. Then for the first time all evening, her expression changed. The sadness disappeared. In its place came something far more dangerous. Absolute certainty. "I'm done hiding," she whispered. Richard nodded once as though he had been waiting years to hear those 4 simple words. And inside the ballroom, completely unaware of the storm about to walk back through those doors, Damien lifted another champagne glass and smiled proudly for the cameras. Believing he had just buried his wife's story forever, he had no idea that he had actually written the first page of his own downfall. Elena stood there for another few seconds before sliding the navy blue folder back into Richard Whitmore's briefcase. "Not yet," she said quietly. "If the truth comes out tonight, it won't be because I'm angry. It will be because it's finally time." Richard studied her face carefully. Even after everything that had happened inside that ballroom, there wasn't a trace of hatred in her eyes. There was disappointment, yes. There was heartbreak buried beneath years of silence. But hatred? No. That was one thing life had never managed to teach her. "You're still protecting him," Richard said. Elena gave a faint smile. "No, I'm protecting the company. Thousands of families depend on Valora. Their lives shouldn't collapse because one man forgot where he came from." Richard slowly nodded. That answer reminded him exactly why she had built an empire while others merely inherited wealth. She always thought beyond herself. She always looked at the people whose names would never appear in magazines. That was the difference between someone who wanted power and someone who deserved it. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, Damien laughed loudly as reporters surrounded him. "Mr. Ashford, what's the secret behind 15 years of unmatched success?" one journalist asked. Damien adjusted his cufflinks before answering confidently. "Vision," he replied. "Fashion isn't about fabric. It's about understanding people before they understand themselves." The reporters eagerly scribbled down every word. None of them noticed an elderly tailor standing quietly near the entrance, invited only because he had stitched suits for several wealthy guests. As he watched Damien speak, the old tailor frowned. "Strange," he whispered to himself. "The man talks beautifully, but his hands have never held a needle." Across the room, Celeste enjoyed every second of the attention. She posed gracefully for photographers while assistants adjusted the train of her shimmering silver gown. She had dreamed of moments like this ever since growing up in a cramped apartment, where electricity was often cut off because her family couldn't pay the bills. Fame had become her escape. Luxury had become her addiction. Looking at the giant screens displaying her image, she quietly believed this was only the beginning. Soon, she imagined she would become Mrs. Ashford. She would own everything Elena had quietly lost. Vanessa stepped beside her carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "Congratulations," she smiled. "You look exactly like the future of Valora." Celeste accepted the glass. "Do you think people will question what happened to Damien's wife?" Vanessa laughed carelessly. "Please. People forget yesterday's headlines before breakfast. Give them a prettier story and they'll never ask about the old one." Both women laughed. Neither realized that someone nearby had heard every word. Standing behind one of the decorative pillars, a young fashion intern named Sophie remained frozen. She had admired Elena for months. Unlike everyone else, Elena always remembered employees' names. She thanked cleaners. She greeted security guards every morning. Once, Sophie had accidentally spilled coffee across a stack of expensive fabric samples. Expecting to be fired, she had burst into tears. Elena had simply handed her a towel and helped clean the mess herself. "Accidents don't define good people," she had smiled. Sophie never forgot that kindness. Watching the woman who deserved respect being mocked tonight filled her with quiet anger. She pulled out her phone and glanced toward the ballroom exit where Elena had disappeared moments earlier. Something inside Sophie whispered that this story wasn't what it seemed. Outside, Elena and Richard slowly walked toward a private elevator, leading to the executive offices several floors above the ballroom. The building had once been an abandoned textile warehouse. 15 years earlier, Elena herself had fallen in love with its old brick walls and enormous windows. While everyone else saw a crumbling factory, she had imagined bright studios filled with young designers chasing impossible dreams. She had purchased the building using every dollar she owned and every dollar she could borrow. Damien hadn't even been in her life then, yet tonight every newspaper called him the man who built it. As the elevator doors opened, Richard quietly asked, "Do you ever regret hiding?" Elena thought for a long moment before answering. "No," Richard looked surprised. She continued softly, I regret believing someone else would protect the truth for me. The elevator rose in complete silence. Each passing floor seemed to carry another memory upward with it. The first showroom, the first employee, the first international order, the first award she had watched from backstage while Damien accepted applause, she believed belonged to both of them. Trust had seemed so easy back then. She had never imagined it could become the most expensive decision of her life. The elevator doors opened onto the top executive floor. Everything was dark except for one office at the end of the hallway. Damien's office. Elena looked toward the closed door for several seconds before quietly turning away. Not tonight, she whispered. Tonight isn't about revenge. Richard followed her toward another office much smaller than Damien's luxurious suite. Very few people even knew it existed. The nameplate outside simply read archives. Richard unlocked the door, revealing shelves filled with carefully labeled boxes stretching from floor to ceiling. Every original sketch, every handwritten pattern, every notebook, every fabric sample from Valora's earliest years had been preserved inside this room. Elena slowly walked toward an old wooden cabinet tucked away in the corner. She opened the bottom drawer and carefully lifted out a worn leather journal. The edges were faded. Several pages had loosened with age. A pressed white jasmine flower rested between its pages, nearly 20 years old. She gently brushed her fingers across the cover before opening it. The first page carried a single handwritten sentence dated almost 2 decades earlier. One day I'll build a fashion house where people matter more than labels. Elena smiled sadly. I almost forgot the girl who wrote this. Richard stood quietly behind her. Maybe it's time the world met her. Elena closed the journal and held it close against her heart. No, she whispered. First, they need to know where she came from. And for the very first time, her mind drifted back nearly 25 years, to a tiny coastal town where expensive gowns didn't exist, where dreams were stitched together under the light of a single flickering lamp, and where a little girl with gifted hands had absolutely no idea that one day she would build a $5 billion fashion empire, only to watch someone else claim it as his own. 24 years earlier, long before the flashing cameras, billion-dollar contracts and glamorous runway shows, Elena Harper lived in a weather-beaten fishing town where dreams were considered luxuries no ordinary family could afford. The streets were narrow, the houses were small, and every evening the salty ocean wind carried the smell of hard work instead of expensive perfume. People there measured wealth differently. If a family had enough bread for dinner, warm clothes during winter, and someone waiting for them at home, they considered themselves fortunate. Elena's family barely had even that. Her father, Thomas Harper, repaired old fishing nets for a living. His rough hands were covered in scars earned from years of honest labor. Her mother, Margaret, worked as the town's only seamstress, spending endless hours bent over an aging sewing machine that groaned louder every winter. Customers rarely had enough money to pay her properly. Sometimes they left vegetables instead of cash, sometimes fresh fish. Occasionally they simply promised to pay later, promises that rarely became reality. Yet Margaret never complained. She believed kindness always found its way home eventually. Every evening after finishing school, little Elena would sit beside her mother watching scraps of fabric magically transform into beautiful dresses. While other children played outside, Elena carefully observed every movement of the needle. She noticed how different fabrics behaved beneath careful fingers, how colors could completely change a person's confidence, and how a simple dress could make someone smile after weeks of sadness. People think I sew clothes, Margaret often whispered while guiding Elena's tiny hands across folded fabric. But clothes aren't what I make. I stitch hope into every seam. Never forget that. Elena never did. By the age of 10, she could repair torn jackets better than many grown tailors. At 12, she designed her first dress entirely by herself. At 14, wealthy women from neighboring towns quietly began requesting dresses made specifically by the little girl with magical hands. Margaret refused to let anyone exploit her daughter's talent. She'll choose her own future, she always answered politely. Not today. Not until she's ready. Unfortunately, life doesn't always wait until people are ready. During Elena's final year of high school, tragedy arrived without warning. A violent winter storm destroyed dozens of fishing boats, including the one belonging to her father. Although Although Thomas survived, the accident permanently injured his back. Overnight, the family's already modest income disappeared completely. Medical bills replaced savings. Food became scarce. College suddenly felt impossible. One cold evening, Elena quietly overheard her parents discussing whether they should sell Margaret's beloved sewing machine simply to afford electricity. She listened from the hallway, tears silently filling her eyes. That old machine wasn't just metal and gears. It represented every lesson her mother had ever taught her. Selling it would mean surrendering the only dream their family still possessed. The next morning, Elena made a decision that changed everything. She packed a small suitcase, kissed her sleeping parents goodbye, left a handwritten note promising she would return successful, and boarded the earliest bus to the capital city, carrying less than $60 and one leather notebook filled with fashion sketches nobody had ever seen. The city welcomed her with indifference. Thousands chased impossible dreams there every day. Elena quickly discovered talent alone didn't pay rent. She worked mornings washing dishes in a tiny cafe, afternoons delivering packages, and evenings altering secondhand clothing in a cramped tailor shop whose owner barely remembered her name. Every night after finishing 16-hour workdays, she returned to her tiny rented attic and continued designing gowns until sunrise. Sleep became a luxury. Giving up never became an option. One rainy afternoon, while carrying repaired garments through downtown streets, Elena noticed a luxury boutique displaying unimaginative evening dresses selling for prices she could hardly believe. She quietly laughed to herself. "I could design something twice as beautiful," she whispered. The boutique owner happened to overhear her. Instead of becoming offended, the elegant elderly woman smiled curiously. "Can you prove it?" she asked. Elena hesitated before slowly handing over one page from her sketchbook. The woman studied the drawing for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. Finally, she looked up and said only 3 words. "Come tomorrow morning." Elena hardly slept that night. The following morning, she arrived carrying her notebook, several fabric samples, and more hope than confidence. The boutique owner introduced herself as Evelyn Laurent, one of the city's most respected fashion buyers. She wasn't interested in promises. She wanted results. Evelyn gave Elena exactly 1 week, a modest budget for materials, and access to a tiny workshop behind the boutique. "If your dress impresses me," she said calmly, "I'll buy it. If not, you walk away and never waste my time again." Elena nodded. 7 days later, she presented a midnight blue evening gown unlike anything Evelyn had ever seen. Every stitch was flawless. Every line seemed effortlessly elegant. The design balanced simplicity and luxury in a way fashion schools spent years trying to teach. Hidden inside the inner seam, where nobody would ever notice, Elena stitched a single silver thread, a quiet signature inspired by her mother's words that hope should always remain hidden inside beautiful things. Evelyn didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, she stood, walked around the mannequin one last time, and simply said, "How much do you want for it?" Elena nervously named a price barely high enough to cover rent for 2 months. Evelyn laughed softly and wrote a check nearly 10 times larger. "Never undervalue your own gift again," she advised. That single dress became the beginning of everything. Wealthy clients began requesting more designs. Fashion magazines quietly mentioned an anonymous young designer whose creations sold out before reaching store shelves. Elena refused interviews, preferring to spend her time creating rather than talking. Within 3 years, she rented a larger studio. Within 5, she employed 12 seamstresses, all women struggling to support their families just as her mother once had. She named the growing business Valora, inspired by the French word for velvet, because she wanted every woman wearing her creations to feel wrapped in quiet confidence rather than loud attention. Success arrived faster than she expected, but fame never interested her. She rarely attended public events, avoided photographers whenever possible, and insisted every employee receive fair wages before paying herself. Investors admired the products but worried about one problem. Luxury brands need a recognizable face, they repeatedly insisted. Customers buy stories as much as they buy clothes. Elena ignored the advice until one afternoon, Destiny walked into her showroom disguised as a desperate young salesman. His name was Damien Ashford. His suit was inexpensive. His shoes were worn, and rejection had become a familiar companion. He wasn't selling clothing. He represented a small advertising agency, trying to convince local businesses to purchase marketing campaigns they couldn't afford. Most companies turned him away before he finished introducing himself. Elena almost did the same, yet something about his determination made her pause. Instead of delivering a rehearsed sales pitch, Damien admitted the truth. "I'm terrible at pretending," he confessed with an embarrassed smile. "Honestly, I don't even think you need advertising. Your dresses sell themselves. I just really need this commission." Elena laughed, genuinely amused by his honesty. Instead of signing a contract, she invited him for coffee. They spent 3 hours talking, not about money or fashion, but about childhood dreams, family struggles, and the strange loneliness that often accompanies ambition. For the first time since leaving home, Elena felt someone truly saw the woman behind the designer. Damien admired her passion. Elena admired his optimism. Neither realized that conversation would reshape both of their futures. Weeks turned into months. Damien began helping with small business tasks despite having no official position. He organized meetings Elena disliked attending, negotiated supplier contracts, and gradually became the energetic public voice balancing her quiet creativity. Employees joked they were complete opposites who somehow fit together perfectly. Eventually, friendship became love. One spring evening, Damien proposed with a modest silver ring he had spent nearly 6 months saving to buy. "I don't have much," he admitted nervously, "but I promise everything I build from this day forward will be built beside you." Standing beneath blooming cherry trees, Elena believed every word. She said yes without hesitation, never imagining that one promise would someday become the biggest lie either of them would ever live. Damien and Elena were married in a small countryside chapel surrounded by fewer than 30 guests. There were no celebrities, no television cameras, and no extravagant decorations. Elena designed her own wedding gown using ivory silk left over from an unfinished collection, while Damien wore a charcoal gray suit that had been tailored twice because buying a new one wasn't yet an option. They laughed through the ceremony, danced beneath strings of warm lights, and promised each other that no amount of success would ever change who they were. Looking back years later, Elena would often wonder whether Damien truly meant those vows or whether success simply introduced a version of him that had been hiding all along. The first 2 years of marriage were everything she had hoped for. Damien worked tirelessly beside her, handling meetings she disliked and speaking confidently with investors who often underestimated a quiet female designer. Elena remained in the studio from sunrise until long after midnight, creating collection after collection, while Damien transformed those creations into business opportunities. They complemented each other perfectly. Employees admired them not because they were wealthy, but because they respected everyone equally. Every Friday evening, Elena personally joined the seamstresses for dinner in the workshop, while Damien celebrated every major contract by handing bonuses to the staff before rewarding himself. During those early years, Valora felt less like a corporation and more like a family. Then everything changed after the company signed its first international partnership. A famous luxury retailer from Paris agreed to distribute Valora's collections across Europe. Overnight, fashion magazines wanted interviews. Television producers requested appearances. Investors demanded glamorous launch events. The world suddenly wanted a face to associate with the growing brand, and Damien fit their expectations perfectly. He was handsome, confident, charming, and comfortable beneath bright lights. Elena, on the other hand, avoided cameras whenever possible. Public attention exhausted her. She preferred sketchbooks to microphones and sewing rooms to red carpets. One evening, after returning from another exhausting investor meeting, Damien found Elena asleep at her studio desk surrounded by unfinished sketches. He gently covered her with his jacket before sitting beside her. When she finally woke, he smiled softly. "They want another interview tomorrow." Elena sighed. "Then you should go." They asked for the founder. "You already know I hate interviews." Damien hesitated before speaking. "What if I became the public face of Valora?" Elena looked at him quietly. "You'd still own everything. You'd still create everything. I'd simply speak for us. It would make negotiations easier. Investors already trust me. The business would grow faster." She remained silent for a long moment. "I don't care who receives applause," she finally answered, "as long as we remember who we're building this together for." Damien reached across the table and kissed her forehead. I could never forget that. At the time, Neither of them realized those words would become the foundation of the greatest betrayal their marriage would ever endure. From that day forward, Damien appeared everywhere. Magazine covers called him the visionary behind Valora. Television hosts praised his genius. Fashion journalists described him as one of the youngest creative minds in luxury fashion. At first, Damien corrected them every single time. "My wife designed everything," he proudly insisted during interviews. "I'm just fortunate enough to help present her work." Elena watched those interviews from her studio with quiet pride. She loved seeing her husband succeed. She believed his success was their success. But praise is a dangerous addiction. Unlike money, it doesn't fill your pockets, it changes your identity. Months passed, then years, and journalists stopped asking about Elena altogether. Investors addressed every email to Damien. Award ceremonies engraved only his name onto trophies. People no longer called him Valora's spokesman, they called him its creator. At first, Damien corrected them. Later, he simply smiled. One afternoon, Elena walked into his office carrying sketches for the company's upcoming winter collection. Damien was rehearsing a speech for an international fashion summit. She paused when she heard him, practicing. "When I created Valora," the words froze her. Where she stood, not we, not my wife and I, just he. Noticed her standing in the doorway and immediately stopped. "I didn't hear you come in. You said I created Valora." Damien forced an awkward laugh. "It's just easier during speeches." Easier for who? For everyone. Elena looked at him for several quiet seconds, then she placed the sketches on his desk without another word and returned to the design studio. That night, Damien apologized. He blamed exhaustion, media pressure, constant travel. Elena accepted the apology because love often chooses forgiveness over suspicion. Unfortunately, forgiveness without change only teaches people that they can repeat the same mistake. As Valora expanded into Asia and the Middle East, Damien spent less and less time at home. Business trips became longer. Phone calls became shorter. Anniversaries became forgotten. Whenever Elena asked whether everything was all right, Damien smiled reassuringly. "I'm doing this for us." She believed him. She wanted to believe him. Meanwhile, another woman quietly entered their world. Her name was Celeste Monroe. She wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Raised by a single mother, Celeste had spent years struggling through auditions, rejection, and financial hardship before finally becoming a successful runway model. She possessed extraordinary beauty, remarkable discipline, and an unshakable determination never to return to poverty again. When Damien first met her during a Paris fashion campaign, he admired her professionalism. When they met again in Milan, they became friends. By the third international campaign, people began noticing they spent an unusual amount of time together. Fashion blogs published harmless rumors. Neither Damien nor Celeste denied them. Inside Valora headquarters, employees quietly exchanged worried glances. Whenever the two arrived together, only Elena seemed unaware, or perhaps she simply refused to believe gossip could destroy a marriage built on years of trust. Vanessa noticed the growing closeness almost immediately. Instead of warning her brother, she encouraged it. "You deserve someone who actually belongs in your world now," she whispered during one charity gala. "Elena belongs." "Does she?" Vanessa looked toward the corner where Elena stood speaking with elderly tailors instead of celebrities. "Look around. You're standing beside royalty now." "She's still living like the girl from a fishing village." Damien didn't respond, but for the first time, he looked at his wife through someone else's eyes. That single moment planted a seed pride eagerly watered. Victoria Ashford proved even more dangerous. She had never completely accepted Elena into the family. In her opinion, Damien's marriage had been appropriate when he was poor. Now, it had become an inconvenience. One evening, she visited their penthouse carrying expensive jewelry. "These belong to influential women," she said while placing a diamond necklace around Celeste's neck during a private dinner. "Some people are simply born to represent luxury." Elena happened to enter the dining room just in time to witness the moment. Victoria didn't even appear embarrassed. Instead, she smiled politely. "Oh, Elena, we were just discussing next season's ambassador." Elena nodded calmly. I see. She neither argued nor questioned anything. She quietly excused herself and returned to her studio. Victoria watched her leave before shaking her head. She never fights for anything, Damien answered absent-mindedly. That's just who she is. No. Victoria replied coldly. That's why people eventually replace her. Neither of them noticed the studio door, remaining slightly open. Elena had heard every single word. She stood alone inside the silent room surrounded by hundreds of sketches, gently running her fingers across unfinished gowns she had spent months creating. For the first time since marrying Damien, a question entered her heart that she had never dared ask. Before, had she slowly disappeared from her own life? Or had everyone else simply stopped looking? That same evening, while organizing fabric samples, she accidentally found an unfamiliar hotel receipt inside Damien's jacket pocket. It wasn't the receipt that made her hands tremble. It was the reservation, 1 room, 2 guests, and the second name wasn't hers. The hotel receipt remained in Elena's trembling hands long after the room had fallen silent. She read the reservation again and again, hoping she had misunderstood something. Maybe it belonged to a client. Maybe Damien had booked the room for someone else. Maybe there was an explanation that would erase the heavy feeling growing inside her chest. But deep down, a quiet voice she had ignored for months finally whispered the truth she no longer had the strength to deny. The marriage she had spent years protecting was already broken. She simply hadn't been the last person to find out. That night, Damien returned home close to midnight. He loosened his tie as he walked through the penthouse, expecting to find Elena asleep. Instead, she sat alone beside the fireplace with the hotel receipt resting neatly on the coffee table between 2 untouched cups of tea. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse him. She simply looked at him with eyes that had become frighteningly calm. "How was Paris?" she asked softly. Damien smiled without thinking. "Busy. Meetings all day." Elena slid the receipt across the table. "So busy. You needed 1 room for 2 people?" The smile disappeared from his face. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Damien sighed. "It isn't what you think." Elena almost laughed. People always say that before telling the truth. He sat down across from her. Celeste was there. "We worked late. Hotels made a mistake with the reservation." Elena looked at him quietly. "You've never been good at lying." He lowered his eyes. That silence became his confession. The room suddenly felt enormous. After a long pause, Elena stood, picked up both untouched cups of tea and quietly poured them into the sink. "I waited until the tea became cold," she whispered. "I suppose I waited for us just as long." She walked toward the bedroom without another word. Damien didn't stop her. He didn't apologize. He simply remained seated, staring at the empty fireplace while the woman who had built his entire world walked away carrying a heartbreak he was too proud to notice. The following weeks were unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. She stopped asking questions. She stopped waiting for Damien to come home. She buried herself inside the design studio, completing Valora's most ambitious anniversary collection in complete silence. Each gown seemed more beautiful than the last. Employees often found her working long after midnight with classical music playing softly in the background. She smiled politely whenever anyone greeted her. No one realized she was stitching goodbye into every dress she created. Meanwhile, Damien's relationship with Celeste became impossible to hide. Fashion blogs published photographs of them leaving restaurants together. Business magazines praised their creative chemistry. Social media users jokingly referred to Celeste as the future queen of Valora. Vanessa secretly enjoyed every headline. Victoria stopped pretending to disapprove. Within the Ashford family, Elena's absence from public life slowly became treated as something permanent. One Sunday afternoon, Victoria invited Damien, Vanessa, and Celeste to lunch at her estate. Elena wasn't invited. Halfway through the meal, Victoria placed a leather folder onto the dining table. "I've spoken with our attorneys," she announced confidently. "It's time to simplify certain complications." Damien frowned. "What complications?" "Your marriage." The room fell silent. Victoria continued as though discussing ordinary business. People expect stability from luxury brands. Rumors damage investor confidence. If Elena quietly retires from public life, we can announce an amicable separation 6 months later. Celeste looked uncomfortable. I don't want anyone getting hurt. Victoria smiled politely. My dear, people get hurt every day. Successful people simply learn not to let emotions interfere with opportunity. Vanessa nodded. Exactly. Damien remained unusually quiet. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't angry. He simply didn't object. That silence hurt more than any spoken betrayal ever could. Across the city, Elena knew nothing about the conversation. She was meeting Richard Whitmore inside a private conference room overlooking Valora's headquarters. Stacks of legal files covered the polished wooden table. Richard removed his glasses before speaking. I've reviewed every corporate amendment made during the past 5 years. And? They've slowly transferred operational authority away from you. Elena remained calm. I expected that, but they couldn't transfer ownership. He opened the original incorporation documents. Every page still carried her signature, every trademark, every patent, every international license, every controlling share. Everything. Richard looked directly into her eyes. They've been acting like owners. They were never owners. Elena gently closed the file. I know. Richard hesitated before asking the question he had avoided for years. Why didn't you ever tell the board the truth? She smiled sadly. Because I thought marriage required trust. And now? She looked out across the skyline where enormous Valora billboards displayed Damien and Celeste smiling together beneath the company's famous silver logo. Now I think trust requires honesty from both people. Richard slowly nodded. I've already prepared every document necessary to restore public control to its rightful owner. Elena looked back toward him. You expected this day. I prayed it would never come. Days later, the entire company focused on preparing for Valora's 15th anniversary celebration. The ballroom transformed into a breathtaking masterpiece of crystal chandeliers, white roses, floating lights, and enormous digital screens. Employees worked around the clock. Design teams perfected every detail. Models rehearsed endlessly. No expense was spared. It would become the most watched fashion event of the year. During rehearsals, Elena quietly walked through the empty ballroom alone. She paused before the massive velvet curtain hiding the founder's portrait. Only she, Richard, and 2 trusted archivists knew whose photograph waited behind it. She reached out and lightly touched the curtain. 15 years. 15 years of silence. 15 years of allowing someone else to stand where she belonged. A young event coordinator approached nervously. Mrs. Ashford? Yes? We've received instructions from Mr. Damien Ashford. What instructions? The young woman hesitated. He requested that your reserved front row seat be moved. Elena looked at her calmly. Where? The back of the ballroom. The coordinator looked embarrassed. I'm so sorry. Elena simply smiled. It's all right. She quietly walked toward the very last row and sat down in the chair no one important wanted. From there, she could see the entire stage. Every light, every camera, every smiling face. She had no idea that the seat they believed was an insult would soon become the perfect place from which the whole world would witness the truth. Late that evening, Richard Whitmore entered the empty ballroom carrying the same leather briefcase he had protected for 15 years. He placed it gently on the stage and looked toward the enormous screen where Damien's image rotated beside Valora's logo. Then he whispered something no one else was there to hear. Tomorrow. Borrowed glory ends. Outside, rain began falling softly across the city. Inside the Ashford penthouse, Damien adjusted his tuxedo for one final fitting while Celeste admired herself in the anniversary gown Elena had personally designed only weeks earlier. Neither of them knew that every stitch in that gown had been sewn by the very woman they planned to erase forever. And somewhere across the city, sitting quietly beside her studio window with her mother's old leather journal resting on her lap, Elena closed the final page, tied a silver ribbon around it, and whispered the words her mother had taught her decades earlier. The truth never rushes. It simply arrives exactly when the lie is strongest. Tomorrow, the entire world would finally discover who had truly built Valora Couture. The following evening, the grand anniversary celebration finally began. Hundreds of cameras filled the ballroom while millions watched the live broadcast from around the world. Fashion critics, celebrities, investors, and journalists eagerly waited for what Damien had called the beginning of Valora's greatest chapter. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors as a full orchestra welcomed the guests. Damien stood confidently at the center of the stage beside Celeste, convinced the night belonged to them. Elena quietly entered through a side entrance wearing the same simple navy blue gown everyone had ignored the previous evening. Once again, almost nobody noticed her. She calmly took her seat in the last row exactly where Damien had arranged for her to sit. From there, she could see every face in the room. She wasn't angry anymore. She was simply ready. Damien stepped toward the microphone as applause filled the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he smiled proudly. 15 years ago, I dared to dream. Today, that dream has become one of the world's greatest luxury fashion houses. The audience erupted with applause. Giant screens displayed photographs of international boutiques, fashion weeks, magazine covers, and celebrities wearing Valora designs. Every image celebrated Damien as the brilliant founder behind the empire. Elena watched quietly without changing her expression. Then Damien continued. "Tonight represents a new beginning. Every successful company must embrace change. Every great legacy must move forward." He extended his hand toward Celeste, and I couldn't imagine a better person to represent Valora's future. The audience applauded once more. Just as Damien prepared to unveil the new company vision, a calm voice echoed from the back of the ballroom. "I believe, before discussing the future, everyone deserves to know the truth about the past." The applause stopped instantly. Every head slowly turned. Elena stood. For the first time that evening, cameras focused on her. Damien frowned. "Elena, this isn't the time." She smiled gently. "Actually, Damien, this is exactly the time." Before anyone could react, Richard Whitmore calmly walked onto the stage carrying the familiar leather briefcase. Several board members immediately recognized him as Valora's longtime legal counsel. Damien looked confused. "Richard, what are you doing?" Richard placed the briefcase on the podium and answered calmly. "My job." He opened the case and removed a thick collection of original legal documents. The original incorporation certificate, the international trademark registrations, the intellectual property filings, the controlling shareholder agreement. Every document carried official seals. Every document carried one identical signature. Richard turned toward the audience. "For 15 years, the public has believed Damien Ashford founded Valora Couture." He paused. "That statement is legally false." The ballroom fell completely silent. Damien's face lost its color. Richard held up the incorporation certificate. The sole founder, the original designer, the creator of every protected collection, and the majority owner of Valora Couture. He looked toward Elena. "Is Mrs. Elena Grace Ashford?" Gasps swept across the ballroom. Journalists immediately began photographing the documents. Television producers abandoned Damien and turned every camera toward Elena. Board members hurried toward Richard, examining the paperwork one page after another. Every signature matched. Every filing predated Damien's involvement with the company. Every legal record told the same story. The empire everyone believed Damien had built already existed before he entered Elena's life. One elderly investor slowly removed his glasses. "I remember now." He looked directly at Elena. "You were at the first investor meeting 15 years ago." Elena smiled politely. "Yes." "You presented every original design." "Yes." "And Damien?" He was introducing himself as our marketing consultant. The investor slowly nodded. "My God." Across the ballroom, whispers became louder than the orchestra. So she was the founder. He lied all these years. She built everything, the interviews, the awards, the magazines. Damien finally grabbed the microphone. This is being misunderstood. Richard calmly interrupted him. No, Mr. Ashford. He placed another document on the podium. This is the board resolution granting you permission to act only as Chief Executive Officer. Another document followed. And this is the agreement proving Mrs. Ashford never transferred ownership. Then another. And these are every registered design patent created solely by Mrs. Elena Ashford, one after another. The illusion collapsed. Victoria slowly stepped backward. Vanessa's face turned pale. Celeste stared at Elena in complete disbelief. You, she whispered. You designed everything I ever wore? Elena nodded gently. Every collection. Celeste looked down at the anniversary gown she was wearing. The very dress that had made her feel like the Queen of Valora had been created by the woman she helped replace. Tears quietly filled her eyes. She removed the company's diamond brooch from her dress and placed it on the table before walking away from the stage without saying another word. Damien tried desperately to regain control. I grew this company. No one denies that, Elena answered calmly. You helped expand it. She looked directly into his eyes. But growing a tree doesn't make you the person who planted its seed. Silence. No shouting. No insults. Only truth. The board chairman slowly approached Elena. Mrs. Ashford. He lowered his head respectfully. We owe you an apology. She smiled kindly. You owe the employees honesty. The chairman nodded. Effective immediately. He turned toward Damien. Your position as Chief Executive Officer is terminated pending a full corporate investigation. Security quietly approached, not to arrest Damien, simply to escort him away from the executive stage, for the first time in 15 years. He stood exactly where Elena had stood for so long, ignored, powerless, forgotten. As he walked past her, he finally spoke. I'm sorry. Elena looked at him for a long moment. I believe you are. He lowered his eyes. I never meant for this to happen. No, she answered softly. You simply kept choosing yourself until there was no room left for anyone else. Damien had no reply. He quietly walked out of the ballroom as hundreds of cameras captured the man who had mistaken borrowed glory for permanent ownership. Weeks later, Elena officially resumed leadership of Valora Couture. Her first decision surprised everyone. She refused to rename the company. She refused to erase Damien from its history. Instead, she published a public statement. A company is not defined by one person's failure, but by the thousands of honest people who work inside it every day. Valora will move forward with integrity, fairness, and gratitude. Employees welcomed her with standing ovations. Factories introduced better wages and safer working conditions. Young designers received scholarships in Margaret Harper's memory. A charitable foundation was established to help talented children from poor families pursue careers in fashion. Richard Whitmore quietly smiled as he watched everything unfold. The company finally has its founder back. Months later, a young reporter asked Elena during her very first public interview, after everything you've suffered, do you regret trusting Damien? Elena looked thoughtfully at the audience before answering. No. The reporter looked surprised. Why not? Because trust wasn't my mistake. She smiled peacefully. Breaking it was his. The interview ended with those words. Years later, people no longer remembered the scandal as the fall of Damien Ashford. They remembered it as the day the world finally learned the name of the woman who had built a $5 billion fashion empire with nothing more than talent, kindness, and an old silver sewing needle her mother had placed in her hand when she was a little girl. And beneath the entrance of Valora's global headquarters, a new bronze plaque was quietly installed. It carried only one sentence. True greatness never demands recognition. It simply remains undeniable when the truth finally arrives.